Well, I just want to say, first of all, thank you. I always enjoy telling the NetraMark story. As CEO, I'm obviously biased, but I'm very excited about where we sit as a company and what the opportunity really looks like. So let me just dive right into it. What is NetraMark? So NetraMark is an AI company with a fully developed technology. This is not a fantasy of what we're planning to build. A fully developed technology that is pointed at the pharmaceutical industry, okay? The pharmaceutical industry runs clinical trials, and you may or may not know, but clinical trials fail at a ridiculously high rate. About 90% of clinical trials from inception of molecule through to commercialization, about 90% fail. So this is a problem that has been going on as long as clinical trials have been running. And our mandate is to use AI to, as we say, optimize response prediction. Those words are carefully chosen, and I will articulate why we chose those words. Essentially, what we do is we take a pharmaceutical company when it's running a clinical trial. At the end of every phase, you have phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, et cetera. You have what's called a clinical trial data readout. It's data that comes from your trial that says, hey, how did this drug work with the patients that were in the trial? And you get data about that, so you can tell whether you met the endpoint, et cetera. We take that data, we ingest it, we run it through our AI, and what spits out are kind of three primary things that pharmaceutical companies are generally interested in. Number one, what's driving drug response or not drug response? What's driving placebo response? And what's driving adverse events? So we have a unique technology that can actually discover if there are subpopulations that were in the trial that could be affecting these things, okay? So this is a very, very important factor for everybody to understand as we go through the trial. So imagine if when you're now getting prepared for the next phase, you passed your phase, now you're getting ready for the next phase of the clinical trial. What if you knew if there were specific subpopulations that were affecting drug response, et cetera, placebo response? What if you could exclude them from the next phase of the trial? Or what if you could include people that are actually responding to the drug, et cetera, in a more feverish rate? Well, that's what we do. We identify those subpopulations so that you can adjust the study for the subsequent phase. That's why we say we optimize response prediction. We often get from people, well, isn't that kind of rigging the trial? Well, what's important to note is this is actually from the FDA, okay? And what the FDA has actually put out guidance to say that if you do these things, the regulator is supportive of these things. So if you can find these subpopulations pre-randomization, so you recruit the people based on what we find, and then after they're recruited, you randomize the study, that's okay. So that's why we say we optimize response prediction, which is ultimately what you want. How can you increase the chances of having a successful clinical trial? Okay, as I alluded to, about 88–90% of trials fail from inception through to commercialization. What we focus on is what we call phase 2 and phase 3 of a clinical trial. Okay, so phase 1 is often a very small a clinical trial. It can be less than 30 participants in that trial. And then you get your readout, and if you pass, you go to the next phase. And then you get your readout, and if you pass, if the results show that you met the endpoint, you go to the next phase, okay? So what we focus on are phase 2 and phase 3 studies. Why do we focus on that? Because this is the worst place to fail in a clinical trial, okay? It's much better actually to fail substantially earlier because you've risked a lot less capital, okay? We focus on two specific therapeutic areas. One's called CNS, which is central nervous system related diseases, things like depression and schizophrenia, et cetera, and oncology. And you can look here, the stats show that you can pass phase 2, and in CNS, you still have a 51% chance as your chance of approval, okay? So you have a 49% failure rate in phase 3. And in oncology, you have a 65% failure rate in phase 3, the worst place to possibly fail a trial. So the question is, when you finish phase 2, is there an opportunity to analyze the data that came out of your phase 2 trial to better set up phase 3 so you can increase the chances of a successful phase 3 and ultimately make it through to commercialization? Okay. The question often comes up is, why do so many of these trials fail? Okay. Many times it's because when you go into phase 3, you're expanding the trial, you're expanding the heterogeneity, and therefore it's sometimes hard to understand what's really happening. Imagine a golf swing. You have a great golf swing when you're hitting your pitching wedge, and you get to the driver and you've got a big slice all of a sudden, and you're not understanding why. Well, imagine if you had a technology that could tell you why you might have a slice when you go into a later phase of a clinical trial. So often what causes failure, wrong endpoints that were not suited. The drug didn't really show a demonstrable benefit over the standard of care. A lot of CNS trials have high placebo issues, okay? So is it possible to figure out what's driving placebo response, et cetera? Those are all the things that are causing clinicians that are running clinical trials to be stressed out at night when they're sleeping. Let's talk about the market. The market is massive. The pharmaceutical industry is massive globally. Cumulative trials since 2010, and these trials often take a long time. That's why I'm looking at cumulative. Got almost 400,000 trials. And then if you look at clinical trial support services, which ultimately are the budgets we pull for when we're running a clinical trial, 25 billion in 23 and 47 billion globally expected in 2032. So you have a massive market. AI in healthcare, as you can imagine, is exploding. I'll talk a little bit about the AI landscape, and it's expected to be about 148 billion by 2029. Anybody that thinks AI is a flash in the pan, et cetera, I would really like to debate them. This is not a flash in the pan. I remember when I worked at IBM and people thought the internet was going to be a flash in the pan in 1999, and that certainly was not true. It's the same with AI. This is going to permeate every industry, every possible business process, et cetera. It's not going away. This is a macro trend. So let's talk about the AI landscape in general, because there's lots of confusion over, well, where does NetraMark sit in this landscape within the pharmaceutical industry? So when you look at this industry, you have to ask yourself the question, where are the natural places for AI to go? And those are the places where there's the most competition, where we don't operate. But I still want to highlight the landscape. So in the first bucket, we've got drug discovery, okay? It makes sense to point AI in the drug discovery area. Why? Because you can ingest massive data sets, and AI loves massive data that it can crunch. And through the crunching of that massive data, it can spit out potential molecules for treatments moving forward. We don't do that. There are many companies doing that. It's highly competitive. Hundreds of millions of dollars are being spent, a high-risk game. I am rooting for it because I do believe that 10 years from now, certainly AI-discovered molecules will be in the marketplace. So that's one area. The other area is what we call clinical trial operations. So now you've discovered your drug and you're into the clinical trial process, okay? Well, when you're running a clinical trial, there are many things you have to do. You have to recruit patients for the trial. You got to run the trial. You got to administer the drug to the patients, et cetera. So there's other obvious places for AI to play there. You can imagine we want to recruit faster and find patients easier. Well, let's ingest these massive electronic medical records to help find these people faster and easier, okay? There's lots of people that are playing in that space. We also don't operate in that space, very crowded. We operate in this area, which is very foundational, I will call it, okay? So as you can see here, at the end, when you're a pharmaceutical company, at the end of every phase of the trial, you get a clinical trial data readout. That's where the information is stored, where you can, from a statistical perspective, analyze and understand, did we meet the endpoint, submit those statistics to the regulator, and you pass or fail. And then if you pass, you can then design another protocol to submit to the regulator to begin the next phase. Well, within this protocol, the foundational layer, the architectural document, essentially, of the clinical trial, there's something in there called the study population. And the study population outlines who should the drug be administered to? Who should be included, the inclusion criteria? Who should be excluded? Imagine if somebody, NetraMark, could ingest the data readouts from each of these phases of a trial and tell you, wait a minute, you should change, we call it enrich, the inclusion-exclusion criteria of this protocol that you're going to submit to the regulator for the next phase. and we can statistically tell you what we think it will do to improve the odds of a pass and avoiding a failure in the subsequent phase. That's what we do. Now, there's a lot less competition in this area. Why? The data sets are small, okay? 65% of clinical trials have less than 100 patients, and over 90% have less than 1,000 patients. These aren't large data sets, okay? There can be lots of variables, but the number of patients isn't very deep, okay? And Dr. Joseph Geraci, who's the founder, the CTO, and the CSO of NetraMark, he is a PhD mathematician, okay? And he spent over 7 years trying to figure out the mathematics of a precision medicine formula that could ingest small data sets and find statistically significant subpopulations that could impact whether the subsequent phase is a success or a failure. So years and years of trying to figure out the mathematics behind that. That's what he figured out. We've built the platform, and that's what we now do. We ingest these small data sets. Okay, we enrich the subsequent protocol design so that you have a greater chance of success in the future phase. That's where we focus on. Now, when I say small data sets, I mean number of patients can be small, but what can be very wide are the number of variables. You're typically looking at 500 to 20,000 variables per patient that are captured in CNS and oncology trials. Furthermore, the data can be multimodal. If you're running a depression study, you would have these qualitative scales, survey questions that are helping assess whether you're depressed or not, et cetera. But you can also have biological data, okay? So if you had just 1,000 variables, just to put this into context, the permutations and combinations of finding 4, 5, 6 variables that are associated with drug response or placebo response or adverse events, one of those things, would be in the trillions. A human can't do this, okay? It's impossible. So what the pharmaceutical companies do now, they do something called a post hoc subpopulation analysis, okay? But in that, what they're doing is they're hand selecting often variables, 3, 4, 5 variables. Where do they get these variables? Well, it's often very experienced medical people or feedback from the regulator, et cetera, that are saying you should look at these variables. So they hand select 2 or 3 from the 1,000 or 10,000 variables and run statistical analysis. Well, think about that. I just told you there's trillions in the permutations and combinations. So this is an impossibility for a human to do. This is what we've done and pointed the AI at this technology. It's proprietary. Okay, we call it a tractor AI. We've kept it as a trade secret. We have not patented it for a specific reason. We do not want to expose the mathematical formulas behind our proprietary AI. Okay? The other thing is you got a market that's massive. You got a problem that needs to be solved, and that clinical trials are failing at a crazy rate. We've got a technology that's built. Now you have to commercialize it, and that comes down to people. So myself as Chief Executive Officer, I've been in the technology my whole career, starting at IBM, many, many years in technology, but I'm not a pharmaceutical person. So I needed to attract and build a team that essentially comes from the pharmaceutical industry. I've been building this team. We launched NetraMark officially in January of 2023 and started the construction process around this, okay? I mentioned Dr. Joseph Geraci. He's the PhD mathematician, but I do want to spend a moment to highlight the other people that have started and joined this business. So Josh Spiegel is our president. He's out of New York. His responsibility is the commercialization. He comes from Verify, which was in the clinical operations side of the pharmaceutical industry. That company was sold to WCG Clinical for $330 million US. He joined our company as president. Dr. Luca Pani, for those of you that are from Europe, was the former Director General of the Italian Medicines Agency, where he ran a multi-billion-dollar budget and oversaw over 800 drugs go into that market. Still works closely with the European Medicines Agency, now resides in Washington. He's a global icon of regulation. He's our Chief Regulatory Officer. Dr. Larry Alfs, our Chief Medical Officer, former Executive Director at Pfizer, Head of Therapeutics, Johnson & Johnson, Director at Novartis. And our most recent addition has been Dr. Angelico Carta. Okay, so when you run a clinical trial, you're often using what's called a CRO, a contract research organization. Dr. Angelico Carta was the co-founder and president of Worldwide Clinical Trials. It's a very large CRO that operates in almost 70 countries around the world. He was co-founder and president, and he joined as chief strategy officer for NetraMark. And we've got some amazing advisors on this. So that's essentially the team. And then I often get this question, well, what do people do with the results that you get them? They do what we've, partly what I've outlined already, which is this protocol enrichment and covariate analysis. That's a fancy way of saying change the inclusion-exclusion criteria or track some variables that you might want to affect down the road. But there's many other opportunities for NetraMark with the same technology stack, including this TPP, which is product profile, which essentially is influencing and helping create the label that you would be utilizing to drive this trial and submit to the regulator. Market access. So once you get approval for phase 3, the work's not done. Now you got to go into the market. What if you had a technology that could ingest the phase 3 data, okay, and tell you who the high responders are, so that when you then go to launch with the doctors and practitioners, et cetera, the supporting publication strategy, the ideal launch patient identification would all be crisply identified to help those marketing efforts. And ultimately, what we're talking here is the future of precision medicine. What you should also know is what's happening now is as a trend, it's starting to happen, is you could get all the way through phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Now there are some phase 3 drugs that are getting they're passing phase 3 and they're not getting approved by the payor. There's no clear unmet need. It's undifferentiated from the other drugs that are on there, and the payor doesn't want to cover them. Okay, we are moving, whether we like it or not, to a precision medicine model, and NetraMark is highly positioned to unearth the subpopulations driving precision medicine. The next part really is, and I just have a couple more slides and then I'll stop and go to questions. We started the commercialization of this company in April of 2023. The sales cycles are very long. Gartner says it's often upwards of 3 years to commercialize. So we're about 21 months in. We've already got a beachhead client where we've closed. We started with 1 contract. Now we've got 4. And we're working on more contracts. They're a over $10 billion biopharmaceutical company listed on the NASDAQ. That's our beachhead client. And right now, what we're doing is we're kind of priced for validation. So the way we price this is it's about $200,000 to $300,000 to evaluate 1 clinical trial data readout, meaning 1 drug that comes out of 1 phase of a clinical trial. So to talk about the addressable market, you'd have to look at a pharma company, their whole pipeline, all the drugs, and at every phase, okay? Ultimately, over time, though, we're not going to be charging this because you can imagine, as we go through validation in the clinical trial space and in the pharmaceutical industry, what really is this technology worth if it's incrementally increasing the chances of success of a clinical trial? So there's a really large sales pipeline that's building with lots of momentum. We're speaking with all sorts of organizations, from large cap, being $100 billion pharma company, mid-size, which are $1 billion, and single compound, which are less than $1 billion. And we're looking at companies that usually have at least a couple drugs in their pipeline. So we've got a robust sales pipeline, priced for validation. The other thing that we're doing from a validation perspective is we have announced a collaboration agreement with a top 5 pharma company. The idea there is to analyze their data from Crohn's disease and to co-publish. Co-publishing is important in the pharmaceutical industry. We also announced a collaboration agreement with the NIMH, which is one of the 27 institutes of the NIH, the largest biological research organization in the world. Okay, we're going to be co-publishing studies there based in ketamine studies. So those collaborations are important because they add to the credibility of what we can tell the pharmaceutical industry. And this morning, we just announced a collaboration with the Ontario Brain Institute to analyze imaging data for major depressive disorder. So amazing collaborations that we need for validation. We're priced for validation with respect to contracts moving forward. And then the other thing is working with the regulator in the US. We are going back and forth with the FDA on the right program to get regulatory approval. Even though we're pre-randomization and don't need it, it's important and helps lubricate, okay? All of this is the one other thing I do want to add too is we're an AI company that has a fixed cash burn, okay, of approximately 150 to 160,000 Canadian per month. I don't think you're going to find a lot of AI companies that have a fixed cash burn in that area. And our gross margins, if you were to look at our financials, you'll see are substantially higher than 90%. So every dollar of revenue comes in essentially goes to covering our SG&A. Okay, so it's very exciting from a cost structure. At a little over 2 million Canadian in revenue, we will start to spit out EBITDA. Okay, this year, 2025, is the year that we begin now to crystallize on a bunch of very, very global arrangements, contracts. By the end of the 2025, our goal is to become EBITDA positive. And so we're very excited about where we sit from the perspective of the company and the valuation. And then the last thing I'm just going to summarize quickly is I want everybody to make sure they understand the technology's built. It's gone through QA validation with a major biopharmaceutical company. It's commercialized. We're already getting contracts. We've got high profile collaborations, which I just touched on. We're focused on CNS and oncology. We have a beachhead client, a rapidly evolving sales pipeline, very high gross margin, low fixed cash burn. And the average revenue multiple in this space is 34. And I've seen them as high as over 90. Okay, so, and a really clean cap table. Matthias, I'll turn it over to you if there's any questions for me in the 8 minutes that we've got left.
Yes,
it was a lot to jam in that time, but hopefully I did a good job.
Indeed, that's a lot. That's maybe the reason why there are currently no questions in, but everyone is welcome to ask questions in the chat or the Q&A function. So you said you had 133 opportunities in your sales pipeline. What kind of conversion rate do you expect from this?
Our goal this year would be to get at least, our goal is 15 contracts out of that. But you got to remember, it's a rolling, because we have to wait for clinical trial data readouts. So that would be a really great goal for us this year. That would allow us to be EBITDA positive.
And in terms of data security, what measures are in place to ensure data privacy and regulatory compliance, especially in concerning sensitive clinical data?
Yeah, great question. So we have met the QA compliance requirements of the FDA. When we do a contract with the biopharmaceutical companies and sign master service agreements, we have to go through QA validation and quality assurance review. So we have very high encryption protocols, et cetera. And we actually have two options on how we manage this. And it depends actually more on the biopharmaceutical company. We can set up an instance of NetraMark, which is our AI technology, inside their firewall. And it's kind of mission impossible like, which is we set it up in their firewall. We analyze the data on their side of the firewall. And once we're done, that instance kind of blows up and goes away. Or we can pass the data securely through the firewall to NetraMark and on our cloud services and analyze the data. And we've got highly encrypted, secure platforms there.
Yeah. And can the AI handle diverse therapeutic areas beyond CNS and oncology effectively?
Yeah, good question. We focus on CNS and oncology because the industry is always asking for use cases. To be quite honest, the AI doesn't care. It's analyzing variables. It doesn't know what is this variable per se. So it's therapeutic area agnostic, but from a sales and go-to-market perspective, we've just decided to start with CNS and oncology, but it's we can go through any therapeutic area.
Okay. And can you mention some successful examples where the AI was used for significant insights?
Yes, we've published some. So we've analyzed third-party data in schizophrenia trials, and we've presented those in posters. And if anybody wants to, they can go to our website and they can see the posters and the publications that show the validation of the technology. I can't unfortunately name our beachhead client, but we've analyzed now 3 of their trials. The feedback from them was that this has changed the way they look at clinical trials moving forward, and we're expanding our contract base. There's 2 parts. There's the publications that you can see on our site, and then there's clients who are expanding their contract base with us.
And I mean, we're talking about an AI. How do you mitigate risks of the AI hallucinating or doing inaccurate predictions?
Another great question. So most AI overfits. And if anybody understands AI, they would know what that means. But it's essentially saying, I gotta ingest the data and put populations into these two subsets, let's say. We actually don't do that. So what we do is we split them into three populations, what we call the good, the bad, and the ugly. Okay, so the good are the people that are treatment responders, placebo non-responders. The bad are the treatment non-responders, placebo responders. And then there's this other group called the ugly. And the machine says, statistically, I'm not going to fit those people because it's going to create hallucinations. It spits them over to the side, actually, and then works on mathematical statistics with the populations that it understands. Number one. Number two, from a hallucination perspective, this is not black box AI. This is what we would call augmented intelligence. So two things happen. Number one, when the results come out from NetraAI, we have PhDs that review the data and input their own kind of feedback, if you will, onto what they're seeing. And number two, when we deliver the results to the client, we also deliver raw data so that they can do their own statistical analysis using their traditional methods to validate what the machine has said, rather than saying, here are the subpopulations and the variables that are associated with drug response, trust us. We don't do that. We actually, we show a route all the way back to the raw data patient identification sets.
Okay. There's a question from the chat. So who are your competitors?
So there's a few competitors. They're coming at this in a very different way. So this would be an Owkin, O-W-K-I-N. And just to give you an idea, they had about 11, 12 million in revenue. And their last raise was a $1.1 billion valuation. Okay, so the revenue multiples are ridiculous here. There's Unlearn AI, but that's a digital twin technology, which is going to require heavy regulatory approval for that to be validated. Okay, so there are ancillary competitors that are taking very, very different approaches and not very many of them. This is very challenging space because we're talking about ingesting the sponsor or the pharmaceutical company's data sets, and those data sets are small, 100, 200 patients. Not very many people know how to do this. Dr. Joe Geraci got his PhD in mathematics with DARPA, the defense industry in the United States. He has his postdoc in oncology, a postdoc in psychiatry, and a postdoc in quantum mechanics. Okay, this is literally a rocket scientist who has figured out how to ingest these small data sets mathematically and come up with statistically valid outcomes.
Okay. So we have less than 60 seconds left. So maybe you can do one last elevator pitch why NetraMark is so interesting. 40 seconds.
40 seconds. I would just challenge everybody to ask themselves, do you understand that there's a problem? Clinical trials fail at a ridiculously high rate, number one. Number two, we have a built technology that you can see the publications, the posters, and now we have product market fit with client that's demonstrating that we can actually solve this problem, okay? And number three, we have an amazing team. This is a very, very difficult industry to penetrate. I would challenge anybody to find a team that has been coalesced around the technology as prolific as the team that we've put together here. You put all of those together, okay, I think this puts NetraMark at a very, very unique position to really, really capture a very, very high market cap over the next 12 to 24 months. And ultimately, I believe we're going to get acquired.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Very interesting presentation.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.